Curious George and the Donut Delivery. George is always a good monkey. When he's asleep, that is. But not when he's awake. But anyway, no monkey in the world wants to sleep all through the Saturday. And this was a Saturday that was crying out for something special. "Donuts," the man with the yellow hat announced. That's what he said. That was special. Apart from bananas, donuts were George's favorite food. "How about eggs with those donuts?" said the man. And then he asked George, the monkey, "Please count how many eggs we have and write it down for me." "Oh dear, there are no eggs. How should I count them and write it down for the man?" thought George. "What do I do?" said George to the man. "There are no eggs, but you asked me to write down a number. I cannot write anything." The man said, "You should write down a 0. But George didn't understand, and he didn't know how. "What's a 0?" he said. "A 0 looks like a circle," said the man. "And that's the first number you begin with. After that comes the number 1. But when there is nothing, you use a 0. 0 means none at all." The man with the yellow shirt told George to sit down, and he gave him some paper and a pen. "You see, George," said the man, "the number 0 alone means no eggs. None. But 0 after other numbers makes them a lot more. If we put a 0 after the number 1, like you can see on my paper, then it means 10. If you put 2 zeros after the number 1, then it means 100. But because George was looking at the zeros the man was using, which were drawings of donuts, he couldn't stop thinking about donuts. And so as he stared at the zeros, they just made him think of donuts, because a 0 looks a little bit like a donut. And so he started to get very hungry. So, very luckily for George and his most empty stomach, they headed out to buy the groceries. The man stopped in front of a market and he said, "I'll go in here and buy eggs while you get the donuts, okay?" George nodded as the man wrote down his order. The note said, 1 dozen donuts, please." As George headed to the donut shop, Charky, a friendly little dog from the neighborhood, ran along to join him. She wanted to play, but George was too busy to stop and hungry and thinking about donuts, so she followed him into the shop. George looked at the note and saw that it only had one little number 1 on it, and that didn't seem like a lot of donuts for a monkey who was really hungry. George saw a pencil on the counter, so he grabbed it and remembered what the man in the yellow shirt had told him about the zeros. And he then drew a 0 after the number 1. Now the note read, 10 dozen donuts. George then decided to write down one more 0 before Mrs. D came to take his order. "George, Charky the dog, good to see you both. Is that an order for your friend with the yellow shirt?" "Yes." George handed over the paper with the note on it. 100 dozen donuts, she exclaimed. "That's our biggest order ever." Mrs. D hurried away to tell her husband joyfully in the kitchen that they had just got an order for 100 dozen donuts. Soon Mrs. D started piling box after box after box of donuts up on the counter. George began to become worried. He hadn't realized what those 2 little zeros would do. Why did those 2 zeros make so many donuts? He thought. Mrs. D carried on counting. 99, 100. You can't possibly carry all of these boxes, George, Mrs. D said. Lucky for you, we have a delivery service. We'll get our driver to bring you all the donuts in his car later on this afternoon. So Mrs. D bustled off to get some help and find the driver. But George the monkey didn't wait around. He already knew he was in trouble. So he grabbed a dozen donuts from the top of the counter and ran away with Charlie as quickly as he could down the street. But George was going to have bad luck because Mrs. D had not been able to find the driver and had asked her entire family to help her carry it down the street. And pretty soon they were all catching up behind George with the boxes of donuts, and George could not run fast enough to get away from them. When George arrived at the apartment block, he climbed up the walls and jumped from one apartment balcony to the next balcony, climbing up the building to try to get home to his room as quickly as possible and out of their sight. He finally arrived at his balcony, climbed through the window, and took a rest in his red chair. At first he thought he was safe from the donut delivery, and he stayed sitting down to catch his breath after all of that running home. But it wasn't long before the doorman showed the D family right up the stairs to the door of his apartment. And soon his whole apartment was full of boxes of donuts, a whole 100 dozen donuts, all in boxes crowding the room. George looked around, thinking, where can I hide these? I have to do something before the man in the yellow shirt comes home. Suddenly, George had an idea. When the man with the yellow shirt and yellow hat came home, all he saw was one box of donuts, 1 dozen. Do you know that a dozen means 12? So 1 dozen donuts is 12 donuts. The man said, they smell good. I wish I'd ordered more than 1 dozen. And so George came clean and told the truth and said he'd made a mistake and told him about what he had done by writing down too many zeros. And the man said, oh well, at least you learned something about counting, but what on earth are we going to do with all of these donuts now? Well, if you ask me, I say we should eat them, said George. Now you know we can't eat all of those donuts, George. We'd better share some with some good people who deserve it. And so, in the end, George got to eat a whole dozen donuts, all 12 of them, just like he was supposed to. And some very hard-working firemen got the rest as a reward for how much they help us all by putting out the fires in the houses. How many left, George? Said the man in the yellow shirt at the end of the day. George was just about to eat the last donut from the last box. He held his fingers up in an O shape that looked like an O, and he said, 0! That's how many. Daddy loves you. I hope you enjoyed my story of George and the donut delivery son. I made it specially for you because I love you so much.